The Sega Genesis was known for a very long time as the platform for arcade ports. Shoot 'em ups, beat 'em ups, run and guns. The system was loaded with some of the best arcade gaming at the time, giving it an early reputation for bringing home games remarkably intact for such an inexpensive piece of hardware. The platform genre would begin to see some branching off from tradition, however. Instead of simply porting the ton of platformers in the arcade, Sega would start the ball rolling by designing a few Genesis exclusive platformers. Even if the game or series had an arcade variant, the Genesis game was usually radically different in presentation or gameplay. Once Sonic the Hedgehog got rolling, this would become the norm on the machine, and boy did it see a lot of representation. So here we go, Sega Genesis platformers. The natural place to start is with the Sonic the Hedgehog series. While far from the first platformers for the machine, they were definitely the most important. Sonic as a series shot the Genesis and Mega Drive to stardom, securing a user base impressed with its speed, colorful graphics, and easily accessible gameplay. Dedicated Sega gamers were already a part of the Genesis collective, but Sonic definitely drew in millions more, and helped Sega become a titan during the 16-bit era. Sonic's brand of flashy presentation and quick gameplay stood in stark contrast to Mario's more methodical pace and focus on exploration and hidden items. Believe it or not, I was not a huge fan of these games back in the day, preferring games with deeper mechanics and more content-driven design. It'd take me a few years to sit down and appreciate them, and while I understand those that still don't like them very much, I have grown a fondness for this type of gameplay. They always had a great look and feel, with solid soundtracks and great sound effects. The gameplay was always responsive and felt great even at the highest speeds. The original Sonic remains my favorite of these original games, but any of them definitely hold their own as classic platformers from the era, with each iteration adding something to the formula. By the time Sonic & Knuckles was released, you could lock cartridges together and mix elements from the various games. Sadly, the Saturn would never see its own traditional 2D Sonic platformer, a void not truly satisfied until over 20 years later with Sonic Mania. The Genesis also played host to 3 Shinobi games, with Revenge of Shinobi being one of the first exclusive platformers on the system. And what an exclusive it was! It combined tight platforming and combat gameplay into an audio and visual feast for your senses. It showed quite early that the Genesis was a machine to be reckoned with. Shadow Dancer would come a year later, and while it was more like the arcade Shinobi than the previous release, it still gave you that awesome, rock-solid gameplay and managed to look even better. It's also more challenging, so if you're a fan of the games that can kick your ass, it's definitely for you. The final game in the Genesis series was Shinobi 3, which managed to be an even better game than the previous entries. Taking elements from Revenge of Shinobi and adding heavy modifications, Shinobi 3 was a faster game, with more varied attacks, better animation, better color, and awesome parallax scrolling. The lone weakness of this one is the soundtrack, which was still pretty solid, but lacked that Yuzo Koshiro flair that was so appreciated in Revenge of Shinobi. No matter which game you choose from this bunch, they all represent some of the best ninja gameplay from that era, and definitely need to be in any serious Genesis or Mega Drive fan's library. Quite shockingly, Mickey Mouse would play a prominent role on Sega's 16-bit platform. It all started with Castle of Illusion, a delightfully lighthearted platformer starring Mickey on a quest to save Minnie from an evil witch. Few games would come out of the blue like this one did. Its gorgeous display of animation and color recreated Disney's characters and worlds perfectly, and the addition of simple play mechanics backed up by tight gameplay made the package instantly appealing and accessible. It's one of the platform's most impressive early titles and has stood the test of time in every way. Only a year later, however, Sega would shit the proverbial bed when it published the externally developed Phantasia. This embarrassment of software design was Castle of Illusion's opposite in nearly every single way. It played like absolute garbage, with poor hit detection, funky platforming that felt unresponsive, and a general lack of playability that had been so strongly associated with the previous release. It is one of the system's most disappointing games. After that disaster, Sega would again turn to an in-house team for Mickey, and we'd get World of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. This return to form would see Mickey given an incredible canvas to shine, with graphics and animation easily rivaling Castle of Illusion, but more importantly, gameplay that was easy to get into and felt very responsive. The soundtrack was also great, belting out tunes even better than Castle of Illusion. It's a great game and one I definitely recommend. Next up is the Great Circus Mystery, starring Mickey and Minnie. This Capcom-produced title had a very different visual style than the previous games on the Genesis. It lacked the overall quality of animation, and even the art style would appear more foreign. It is a fairly competent platformer, however, and plays well enough to recommend to fans of the genre. Around that same time, though, another Mickey game would be released. Mickey Mania would be published by Sony, and was much closer to the vision Sega had for the character. The art style and animation here is very impressive, and the variety in gameplay is definitely to be commended. The game does have issues with stage design and cheap deaths, but its overall ease of difficulty balances it out. There's a superior Sega CD version of this, but the cart version is fine if that's all you have access to. Disney platformers didn't stop with Mickey Mouse. We'd also get the mega popular Aladdin from Virgin Games. Based on the movie, this superbly animated and colorful action game further cemented the Genesis as the new home of the best Disney games. The floaty gameplay took a bit of getting used to, but otherwise played well. The art faithfully recreated the animated film extremely well, and the game remains very affordable at under $20. The Genesis would also get a port of Lion King, another platformer based on one of Disney's popular animated films. This one took some getting used to as well, with platforming and stage design not easily accessible on first inspection. It frustrated my daughter instantly with cheap deaths and falls that resulted in starting back at the stage's beginning. It does look and sound the part though, and later stages improve significantly. Its cheap price and overall decent showing does warrant a look for fans of the film. Super late in the life of the Genesis, we'd get Pocahontas from Disney Interactive. This puzzle-heavy platformer would focus on using animal abilities and stealth to navigate its levels. It has some of the best animation of any 16-bit era release, but suffers a bit from unresponsive gameplay that is compounded by some disjointed level design. It's a very kid-friendly game though, so it's something you can play with your family. Batman would also get in on the licensed platformer releases, starting with Batman the video game from Sunsoft. This one is based on the 1989 film by Tim Burton. I absolutely adore this game, and it's one of my favorites on the machine. The soundtrack alone is worth playing it for, but the game also looks great and has very solid play mechanics. The challenge is there, and it follows the movie pretty closely in regards to locations and bosses. A complete copy is getting a bit expensive at around $45, but it's totally worth it in my opinion. In late 1992, Sega of America would show up with the next game in the series, Batman Returns, and completely embarrass itself, the system, and the franchise. This awful game has some terrible graphics, piss poor gameplay, and horrible use of the Genesis sound hardware. It fails at everything that made the first Batman great, and even at its low asking price of sub $20, it's still not worth adding to your library. It's a disgraceful game that really shows Sega had no quality control whatsoever on their outsourced games. Around the same time as Batman Returns, Sunsoft would release Batman Revenge of Joker. It would be outsourced to a Western studio as well, and while not as bad as Batman Returns, was still a major letdown. The graphics were colorful and well detailed, but the gameplay felt sluggish, with stage designs that relied on cheap hits for its difficulty. It's not terribly expensive at $35 or so you may want to take a look at it. The series would hit rock bottom in 1995, when Acclaim would digitize the hell out of everything, copy Mortal Kombat's gameplay mechanics, and attempt to superglue it all to the Batman license. The end result was Batman Forever, a truly dreadful game based on the movie. This one is a mess of design, with dark, soulless graphics, music that sounds like it was composed on a calculator, and gameplay that made no sense at all for a platformer. It was slow, clunky, ugly, and isn't worth the $5 you can buy it for. It's one of the system's worst games. Even 7-Up's little red mascot Spot would show up to represent, getting his own game in 1993, Cool Spot by Virgin Games. Collect the spots as you navigate the stage and release your friends. This one was fairly utilitarian, lacking any real polish or flashy art design. It did play decently though, and was solid enough to warrant a sequel, which was just awful. This isometric train wreck lacked precise gameplay and had terrible hit detection, resulting in a game that had little appeal past its main character. Both Spot games are cheap, but I can only recommend the first. A new hero would emerge during the 16-bit era in 1994. Released by Playmates Interactive, Earthworm Jim would burst onto the scene with incredible popularity. You take control of Jim, a common earthworm imbued with special abilities by an alien suit. Its varied gameplay, humor, animation, and soundtrack were all well received, and the game was challenging as hell to boot. It's one of those new IP success stories of the era, and remains a very playable game today. It was so well received, a year later we'd get Earthworm Jim 2. This one would take the silly humor, varied gameplay, and solid animation up a notch, resulting in a great sequel with staying power. So solid a showing was this, I dare say it was a better game than the original. Both these games are still affordable at around $30 or so if you're a fan of the genre, they are absolute must-owns. The Valis series would have a showing on the Genesis as well, albeit out of order. Valis 3 would be the first game released in mid-1991, courtesy of Renovation. Gameplay consists of simple platforming segments and sword attacks that can be powered up. There is also a magic system in place for a variety of extra firepower, and 2 other playable characters with different abilities. Despite the simple graphics and gameplay, I enjoyed this one and loved the soundtrack. Later that year, we'd get Valis the Phantasm Soldier. This is the original story of our hero, how she came to obtain the Valis sword, and the revelation of her destiny. It plays and looks very much like Valis 3, but with even better music. The gameplay is again pretty simple, with straightforward platforming, sword power-ups, and a fairly easy to use magic system. Though this one was very similar to 3 in presentation and gameplay, I found the power-ups and story to be more interesting here, and combined with the killer soundtrack, it made this Valis the one to own. Unfortunately, the Genesis would never see a port of Valis 2 intact, instead getting the 1992 released Sid of Valis, a super deformed remake. This is the low point of the series, and a damn disappointment in every category. The gameplay feels overly fast and floaty, and graphics are simple and lack appeal, and even the wonderful music from the other two releases failed to be delivered here. I recommend passing this one by and going after the other two. There's quite a few Wonder Boy games between the Master System and the Genesis, but I want to talk about Wonder Boy in Monster World. Released in early 1992, this platformer was also loaded with RPG-like elements. You could visit towns, buy items, go on missions, and upgrade your stats. It's a colorful, well-drawn and animated game, with slow but tight gameplay that is easy to get into. Its brand of RPG-light elements really enhances the experience, making this one a unique and truly fun experience. In 1994, a Japan-only sequel would land on the Mega Drive, Monster World 4. This time you play as a young girl, a departure for the Wonder Boy series, but the same RPG-light and platforming mixture would return better than ever. The graphics have been improved here, with better animation, color usage, and more background detail. Also improved is the gameplay, which is faster and more varied than before. Melee attacks now have more variations, and the main character can have her pet aid her in various ways during exploration and combat. This one is now available on the PS3, Wii, and 360 in English, and there is an English patched version for the Mega Drive. Whichever way you have to access it, definitely give this great little game a look. Konami showed up on the Genesis in a big way, bringing some of their best games to Sega's hardware for the very first time. Among those properties was Rocket Knight Adventures, an awesome platformer with varied gameplay, fantastic music, and gorgeous graphics. Everything about this one is a joy to behold, and I consider it some of Konami's finest work on the machine. The visual appeal of this game cannot be denied, thanks to great animation, tons of parallax scrolling, and continued use of Konami's unique special effects for the machine. Gameplay would also be mixed up with shooter segments, huge boss battles, and stages that had the hero doing a lot more than jumping and attacking to survive. This one remained Genesis exclusive and is a must-own, even at its asking price of around $50 complete. A year later, Konami would release a sequel titled Sparkster after the main character. This one would continue the adventure, and while it's still a very good game, it was a step back in some ways for me. The first and most obvious change is in the background detail and overall color use of the game. Rocket Knight Adventures had a great use of color and art that looked almost like each area was hand-drawn. Sparkster's color is more flat, and its backgrounds and foregrounds use repeated patterns across the entire level, taking away from the overall visual polish. The backgrounds also seem to lack detail from the previous game, often with sparse skies and less parallax scrolling. Luckily, the gameplay and music are still solid, and retain enough of what made the first game so good to warrant this one's existence. It tends to be a little more expensive than the first due to rarity, and can be gotten by a patient eBayer for around $70. Capcom would even bring some of the Megaman games to the Mega Drive in 1994. Megaman The Wily Wars was a compilation of the first 3 Megaman games from the 8-bit NES era. They would be improved with more color and added content, but lacked the overall polish of a true 16-bit experience. Still, it was Megaman on a Sega platform, and it still had enough of the classic charm to be a great addition to anyone's library. It would only see retail release in Japan and Europe, with American gamers only seeing it on the Sega Channel, a paid service that allowed users to play Genesis games over their cable service. Reproductions of this release are everywhere, as the real deal is super expensive. A complete unit in great shape will easily run you $300+, making it a true collector's item. Some of those reproductions are pretty damn good for those of you not averse to such things. Wolf Team's El Viento would be released in 1991 by Renovation. This ultra-fast-paced action platformer stars Annette, a heroine on a mission to stop the resurrection of a dark god in 1920s New York. You attack with a boomerang and various magic attacks you collect along the way. The pace of this one will challenge most gamers to their limits, and you'll need to play it a bunch to get used to the enemy locations and bosses. Though the level design can be funky at times, and the enemy placement cheap as hell, it is a relatively solid experience. The graphics and sound aren't among the best for the system, but what's here isn't terrible or distracting. Complete copies of this one go upwards of $100 or more, so I recommend you try it before you plunk down the cash. Sega had its fair share of strange games, and Treasure would contribute to that list with 1994's Dynamite Headdy. You control a puppet that attacks with its head, in a bid to defeat the evil king Dark Demon. Headdy can navigate the world by jumping and grabbing select items with his head, and can also find power-ups that allows him to use different powers for his head. The variety of gameplay is truly excellent, and in true Treasure form, the engine does some truly great things with all that awesome 16-bit power of the Genesis. Bosses are predictably large, and even the soundtrack is solid. The best part of Dynamite Headdy is, it doesn't cost a fortune, hanging around the $35 mark. The Japanese version is considerably more expensive, thanks to the North American version being heavily changed during localization, but there is an English port of that available. Another weird one, Sega would publish Vic Tokai's Decap Attack in 1991. This completely changed localization was known as Magical Hat no Butabi Turbo in Japan, and nearly everything was made over to create this release. You are now Chuck D. Head, a mummy on a mission to stop the invasion of the world of the living by the maniacal Max D. Cat. Your headless corpse can attack with a face in your midsection, or by jumping on enemies until they die. You can also get a skull power-up that acts as a boomerang, allowing you distance attacks. Decap Attack is a very decent game for what it is. The visual presentation and music rub some the wrong way, and the overall silliness of the plot can turn you off, but the gameplay here is solid and challenging. It's another game that goes really cheap, and I've seen complete auctions go for a mere $20, which this game is worth every penny of. Sonic Team didn't just make Sonic games on the Genesis, and in 1995, they'd release Ristar. Unlike Sonic, Ristar wasn't about speed, instead focusing on slower, more exact gameplay. You'll attack with extendable arms that grab enemies and allow you to knock them off the screen. Your arms can also grab parts of the level to allow you to access different areas. Ristar is a damn good looking game with some great animation and colorful environments. The music is solid too, and has a very Sonic 3 vibe to it. The gameplay is much different from Sonic's team's prior efforts, and stands out nicely in the genre. Because of the late release and crappy paper boxes they came in, getting this one complete in good shape is really tough, and you'll drop close to $60 to do it. It's a good game, but definitely try it before you run out and buy it. Sega would also release the internally developed Kid Chameleon in 1992. There's a new arcade game in town, and kids are disappearing while playing it. You must enter the game and face the evil AI, Heady Metal, in a bid to free them. Kid Chameleon is a run and jump platformer similar in style to Mario, but with the added mechanics of using masks to obtain power-ups and abilities to dispatch your foes. You'll change into samurai warriors and even tanks on your way through its many levels. The game is huge, with multiple branching levels and no save system, making the original Genesis release a pain to beat in one setting. If you're interested in this one, play it on one of the many compilations or digital releases it was part of, so you can have access to save states. Otherwise, the original Genesis cart goes for under $20. There's also some hyper rare games on the system, with 1994's Pulse Man definitely on that list. This one was developed by Game Freak, the same studio that would go on to create the Pokemon games. You are Pulse Man, a half-human, half-computer hero who sets out to stop his terrorist father from destroying the world. You'll use your unique electricity powers to defeat his enemies and navigate both real-world and computer stages. Pulse Man was only released in Japan in cartridge form, and North American gamers only saw it via the Sega channel. PAL gamers never got an original release of the game at all, but there is a Wii Virtual Console release from 2009. There is also an English patched release available for the Mega Drive, and tons of reproductions available of that patch. The original Japanese release complete in box goes for upwards of $400 in good shape, making this one of the most rare and expensive games in this episode. The 1992 released Alesia Dragoon was a game nobody saw coming. Sega didn't advertise it at all, and it just showed up on store shelves out of the blue. I had no clue what the hell it was, but the box art was cool, and the pics on the back of the box looked interesting. I picked it up, and boy was I shocked that Sega hadn't trumped this one up more. You play as Alesia, a female warrior that attacks with lightning blast that auto-targets the enemies. You also have a pet dragon that will help you out a bit. This is one of the more simple and straightforward platformers on the machine, but it still has a charm and a challenge that makes it a great addition to the library. It was done by Game Arts, so the game has an inherent fun factor that can't be denied. The game has exploded in popularity and price in recent years, now going for about $100 complete. It's a great trip down memory lane for me, but at that price you definitely should play it to make sure it's what you're looking for. I want to thank you guys for watching my Sega Genesis platformer episode. Now, as you know, I didn't come anywhere near close to covering every platformer on the machine. So down in the comments, let me know what games you would like to see in a part 2 to this episode. I'm Sega Lord X. I really appreciate you guys watching. I'll catch you next time.